The role of Poles in the Russian Empire was significant and complex, shaped by a long history of political, social, and cultural interactions. When Poland was partitioned in the late 18th century, many Poles found themselves living within the borders of the Russian Empire. The incorporation of Polish territories into the Russian Empire led to a period of both cooperation and conflict between the Russian authorities and the Polish population. Poles in the Russian Empire held various positions in the military, government, and cultural spheres. Despite facing some restrictions and discrimination, many Poles achieved prominent positions in the Russian administration and military. Some even rose to the highest levels of the Russian government, including military leaders such as Tadeusz Kościuszko and Józef Poniatowski. Culturally, Poles played a significant role in the intellectual and artistic life of the Russian Empire. Warsaw, as a major center of Polish culture, maintained its cultural significance despite being under Russian rule. Polish writers, artists, and scholars made important contributions to Russian cultural and intellectual life. However, the relationship between the Russian Empire and the Polish population was often strained, particularly during periods of Polish uprisings against Russian rule. The November uprising of 1830 to 1831 and the January uprising of 1863 to 1864 were significant events in which Poles sought to assert their independence from Russian control. These uprisings were brutally suppressed by the Russian authorities, leading to further tensions between the two communities. Despite these tensions, the Russian Empire also made efforts to integrate and assimilate the Polish population. Policies aimed at Russification and the suppression of Polish language and culture created additional sources of conflict between the Russian government and the Polish community. The history of the Baltic people in Russia is rich in events and has many cultural influences. The Balts are residents of the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. For many centuries, they have been closely connected with Russia as a neighboring country, and their history is permeated with interaction, joint events, and the influence of cultural traditions on each other. Ties between the Baltic states and Russia go back to ancient times. Since the 14th century, most of the Baltic region, including present-day Latvia and Estonia, became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which in turn became part of the Royal Polish-Lithuanian Republic. At this time, there was active cultural and economic interaction with Russia, especially through trade and diplomatic ties. In the 16th century, Lithuania and Russia fought twice for influence over the Baltic region, which led to closer contacts between these peoples. In the 17th century, most of the Baltic region became part of the Russian Empire through wars and diplomatic agreements. Under Russian rule, the Balts continued to exist as a distinct ethnic and cultural element, preserving their traditions, language, and culture. One of the important moments in the history of the Baltic states in Russia was the formation of their national identity in the 19th century. National awakening among the Baltic people led to the emergence of national movements and literature that contributed to the preservation and development of Baltic culture. During this period, the Russian Empire also began to pursue a policy of integrating the Baltic states into the social and political life of the country. The Soviet period in Russian history had a huge impact on the Baltic states. As a result of the 1917 revolution, the Russian Empire became the Soviet Union, and the Baltic countries became part of this new political entity. During the Soviet period, the Balts faced political repression, Sovietization campaigns, and the loss of some aspects of their culture under the influence of Soviet ideology. Over time, the Baltic states gained independence from the Soviet Union, and Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia became independent states. This period in the history of the Balts in Russia is associated with the massive outflow of the Russian-speaking population from these countries and subsequent tense relations between the Balts and the Russian-speaking population. Modern relations between Russia and the Baltic countries have developed under the influence of historical events. In this regard, provocative questions have arisen about the recognition of Soviet actions, repression, and occupation against the Baltic states by the Russian government, which causes disagreements and tense moments in diplomatic relations between Russia and the Baltic states. The history of Jews in Russia over the centuries has been complex and multifaceted. Jews lived in Russia long before the rise of the Russian Empire. They played a significant role in the cultural, economic, and political life of the country. In the Middle Ages, Jews were a fragmented society within the territory of what is now Russia. In 1772, during the first partition of Poland, the Russian Empire gained a significant Jewish population for the first time after annexing eastern Poland. Later, as a result of the second and third partitions of Poland in 1793 and 1795, Jews became the inhabitants of much of Western Russia. At the beginning of the 19th century, Emperor Alexander I issued several regulations that improved the situation of the Jews. However, in the second half of the 19th century, under pressure from anti-Semitism and religious intolerance, the government of the Russian Empire began to impose restrictions on Jews. This included measures such as palatalization, residence restrictions, and quotas for Jewish students at universities. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, many Jews left the Russian Empire due to persecution and discrimination. Many went to the United States and other countries, as well as to Palestine, at that time under the Ottoman Empire. The period after the October Revolution of 1917 brought some improvements for Jews in Russia. The Bolsheviks proclaimed the equality of all nationalities and religious groups and abolished many anti-Semitic restrictions. During this period, Jews occupied high positions in the Soviet government and cultural sphere. However, in the 1930s, during the period of Stalinist repression, many Jews were subjected to political oppression and repression. During the Great Patriotic War and its aftermath, Jews faced anti-Semitic propaganda in connection with the Israeli-Arab conflict and Zionism. During the 1950s, many Jews became victims of anti-Semitic campaigns, including arrests and loss of jobs. During this period, a significant Jewish emigration flow began from the Soviet Union to Israel and other countries. The situation of Jews in Russia began to change in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the introduction of a new constitution and the strengthening of civil liberties, many restrictions and discriminatory laws were repealed. Currently, Jews constitute a small but active and influential part of Russian society. They make significant contributions in various fields, including science, business, culture, and politics. The Jewish community in Russia has its own synagogues, schools, and cultural centers, and continues to preserve its history and traditions. In addition, Russia is home to one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, as in many other countries, anti-Semitism is still present in Russian society, and incidents of anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks occasion. The history of the presence of the German population in Russia goes back several centuries. The first German settlements appeared on the territory of the Russian Empire in the 18th century in connection with the policy of attracting foreign specialists and landowners. One of the first large German settlements in Russia was the Bremen settlement of Gallic, founded in 1764 in the Volyn province in what is now Ukraine. The main attractive factor for the Germans was the opportunity to obtain land and property rights, which they had been deprived of in Germany. Gallic became the first experiment of the Russian Empire in developing land by inviting foreigners. During the period of cataloging and surveying the regions of Russia, the Germans were carried out to various parts of the country, where they founded their settlements. German colonization took place mainly in the southern and southwestern regions of the Russian Empire, such as Free Estonia, Bessarabia, Crimea, and the Caucasus regions. In total, there were about 600 German colonies in the Russian Empire. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the German population in Russia reached its peak. They were actively involved in the economic, cultural, and political life of the country. German scientists, entrepreneurs, and cultural figures made a significant contribution to the development of Russia. The German colonies became a favorable environment for the development of agriculture, industry, and trade. However, with the outbreak of the First World War and revolutions in Russia, the position of the Germans changed dramatically. Many Germans began to be discriminated against and persecuted. During the period of Soviet power, mass deportations of Germans to Siberia and Kazakhstan were carried out, as well as repressions and forced labor. During World War II, the German population suffered from suspicion and repression, especially in connection with Nazi Germany. After the war, many Germans who survived the repression were resettled in Germany or went there as volunteers. Most of the German population remaining in the USSR was settled in the regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Also, in subsequent years, Germans began to actively emigrate from Russia to Germany and other countries. Today, the German population in Russia is a small proportion of the total population. Remnants of historical German colonies still exist, but the role of the German population in Russian society has been significantly reduced. The history of the Swedes in Russia begins with the Great Northern War, which took place at the beginning of the 18th century between Sweden and Russia. As a result of this war, Russia greatly expanded its territories in the northwest and Central Asia, and Sweden was defeated and lost a significant part of its possessions. After the war, many Swedish soldiers and citizens ended up on Russian territory. Some of them chose to stay in Russia and joined the Russian army or were accepted into Russian citizenship. Large Swedish cities such as Helsingfors, now Helsinki, and Lexlandia, now Petrozavodsk, were captured by Russia and became part of the Russian Empire. In the 19th century, Swedish colonists began moving to Siberia, the Far East, and Kazakhstan, attracted by the opportunities for farming, fishing, and mining. The Swedes actively participated in the development of Siberia, the construction of railways, and the development of industry. In the 20th century, Swedes in Russia began to be subject to repression by the Soviet government. Many of them were arrested, killed, or deported to northern Russia and other remote regions of the country. Swedish cultural and social organizations were banned, and the Swedish language was suppressed. There are currently a small number of Swedes living in Russia, mainly in St. Petersburg and other large cities. Swedish cultural traditions and customs are preserved through various social organizations and clubs. In addition, many Russian citizens have Swedish roots and maintain ties with relatives in Sweden. Thus, the history of the Swedes in Russia is associated with political conflicts, migration, and repression, but also preserved a rich heritage in the cultural and social spheres.